to kick off early and have a bit of extra time, or we get to lunch a little earlier, wonderful. Please do come and join me on stage. And the theme for our next talk is Western Civilisation Decoded. So I'm sure some extra time is going to help here. And I'm delighted. Please, would you like to sit over there, or do you want to use?
If that's okay.
Yeah.
But before we do, I'll let you take a little selfie with you, the audience in the background.
Okay. If we're willing to stop it.
Everyone, look excited, because we're going to take a little picture, and you're in the background. Here we are. Good. And I'm glad there's a big crowd, otherwise this would look really bad. So thank you very much. Now,
let me introduce you.
maybe put the chairs in the middle.
You may sit where you like, but I don't know if the microphones will travel.
Yes. We sit in the middle together rather than off to the side. That would be okay.
So let me begin by introducing Subhadra Das, who's a writer, historian, curator and comedian. She specialises in the history and philosophy of science, particularly the history of scientific racism and eugenics, and for 9 years was curator of the science collections at University College London. Subhadra's book, Uncivilised, 10 Lies That Made the West, examines racist thinking and biases underlining key concepts we use every day, while arguing for the need to consider non-Western worldviews and philosophy. So very much, I feel very SOAS theme there. And her moderator is Paul Waters, who's an award-winning BBC broadcaster, producer, podcaster and author. He's co-host of the We'd Like a Word books and Authors podcast. Paul is also the author of the historical crime thriller Blackwater Town, set in 1950s Ireland, and the forthcoming Delhi Hotel Mysteries, set in contemporary India. And he's chosen to set these books in the two areas between which he divides his time. So no murder mysteries on stage today, please, but looking forward very much to hearing your discussions. Thank you, Subhadra.
Thank you very much. Can you hear us? Okay, good. Thumbs up from the back, so that's good. And I'm really pleased to be here with Subhadra, and I'm delighted to see you when she walked in. I was relieved as well. And we're here to talk about this very good book. It's proof that I've read it, dog-eared throughout, and it's called Uncivilised, 10 Lies That Made the West, which makes it sound, it is polemical to some extent. And there is a lot of serious stuff, but it's also very funny and very warm, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's for sale in the bookshop, so I recommend you get your copy autographed after you buy it.
Please.
And I was shocked to hear that it hasn't yet been reviewed in the Eastern Eye. So, Eastern Eye, I recommend you give some column space.
And available for interview.
Also available for interview, yes. So I will just add a little bit of introduction.
Please.
To say that you look at the relationship between science and society, you specialise in history and the philosophy of science, especially the history of scientific racism and eugenics, and you were curator of the science collections at UCL, University College London, and we know about your presenting, podcasts, your museum exhibition curations, and your appearances on TV and radio. And I'm not even sure if we should allow questions. Maybe you should just do a stand-up routine at the end instead. And
I feel like I'll be considerably lowering the tone, given the little that I caught of that last presentation.
Well, okay, so Uncivilised, it's about 10 ideas and how they shape our view of the world and each other in extremely unhelpful ways. So the subtitle, 10 Lies That Made the West. Maybe you should tell us a little bit about that to start with.
Well, I think the main thing to point out is that I'm not 100% responsible for the title, and that it's the job of publishers to sell books. So if you feel that the title is unnecessarily provocative, there's a part of me that agrees with you. I would have gone with 10 myths that made the West, because I'm a writer and I like alliteration. But I think one of the things about that is a myth is a thing that is not true. And a lie is a... Sorry, can people... Oh, there we go.
Are you
can
hearing
everyone
us
else
okay?
hear me? Just generally, I'm used to talking to myself in any case, so thank you. So, yeah, a myth is a thing that is not true, which is the same thing as what a lie is. And I think the word lie has a power inherent in it because these stories do not tell themselves. They are stories that we are told. And
somebody tells them to us.
And someone does tell them to us, indeed. I often used to say when I was a museum curator, in the museum world, there's an expression everyone loves, which is hidden histories. And I was like, well, if they were hidden, someone did the hiding. And so I'm not suggesting anyone is on a way to a hiding here, but the goal...
Stand-up comedy coming out.
Yeah. As I said, we are going to lower the tone. I'm also mildly insulted, by the way, as a Bengali person, that anyone would think that Tagore was provincial, but I nonetheless appreciate the point was accurate. A quote from him starts this book, by the way.
Yes, let's hear it.
It's a short one, which is great. Tagore said, in 1930, as a lecture he was giving in New York City, a great portion of the world suffers from your civilization. And it's very succinct. He was a prolific writer. It's often been said that it would be impossible in a whole lifetime to read everything that Tagore has written. So I commend you for your efforts. But he was also remarkably concise, and I agree with him as far as that was concerned.
Okay. Well, some of the myths, lies, whatever, that the book covers are our notions of science, education, nation, the biases behind justice and inequality, the biases behind justice and individuality, the reality of democracy, critiquing capitalism that shapes our ideas about time, death and art, and looking to non-Western worldviews that you would say do the job far better. Mm-hmm. I want to start with one that appealed to me. So you range all over the world, and I learnt a lot about things that I didn't know, not necessarily because of my ignorance, I'm excusing myself, but maybe because they
you're very well read.
They were suppressed.
Yeah.
So there was in the Inca region of South America, when the Spanish came in, they were particularly keen to eradicate a particular thing called quipu knot bundles. Mm-hmm. So the Spanish thought, these uncivilized people, they have no literature, no recording, they kind of don't exist. But would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, as with so much to do with history, it all kind of comes down to historiography. And the point that I make, so that story, the story of the Inca quipu, appears in chapter 3, which is entitled "The Pen is Mightier Than the Sword." And the point I wanted to make in that chapter was, your pen is only as mighty as your sword if you happen to be holding a sword in the first place. And the reason why the Inca story appealed to me, I trained as an archaeologist, I have some anthropological training as well, and the way that the Inca are presented generally is through this thing called the Inca paradox, which is that you had a very capacious, so it's the largest empire in the world at the time, and it covers a huge amount of geography, a huge number of different people. It was a high control empire. So let's not pretend, I'm not trying to say that the Inca
were
are
nice guys.
Wonderful. Yes, exactly, yeah. Hashtag all empires. They are a very high level of control. They move people around to create, discontinuity and as a way of clamping down on dissent. They're at a vulnerable point when the Spanish turn up because it's following a period of instability that a new Inca, which is also the name of the leader as well as the name of the people, has been put in. And the Inca paradox is this idea that you have this enormously advanced civilization in the absence of writing. And the point I wanted to make in that chapter was they did have writing, it just doesn't look like what Western writing is. It's not marks on a page, it's a series of knots tied a long string. That sounds ridiculously simple, but it's phenomenally complicated. There is numerical systems involved in this. We've seen actually in the aftermath of the arrival of the Spanish that they might have come up with an alphabetic way of writing the quipu. It's not simply where the knot is on the thread. It is the colour of the string. It is the number of the ply. It is the direction in which the knots are tied.
And these could become hugely elaborate.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So they are and what they're doing is that they are acting as a historical record. They are operating as census, so keeping track of who was where and what they are doing. There is accounting. A lot of archaeological writing is phenomenally boring because it's accounts and maybe a bit of pharmacy thrown in for fun. But to suggest that the Inca was somehow uncivilized because they didn't have writing is to completely miss the point. But also the Spanish had a vested interest in saying, these are savage people. They refused to accept Christianity, therefore we can do with them what we want.
I like the idea that the Spanish, the West, was deriding this system as insignificant and meaningless and pretty ridiculous and stupid. It didn't count. But they also went to some trouble to eradicate this thing that they thought wasn't really important, which is why we're quite ignorant about it.
It is, and I mean, there's complicated aspects to this history, which is that not everyone in Inca society would have been able to read the quipu. It is something, that was done as specialist knowledge. But yeah, the Spanish burned a whole bunch of them as well. So there's nothing left to read.
So they say it's a form of book burning, you could say.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So I like that idea that, first of all, you say, well, they don't have writing, so they're not civilized, and now we're going to burn their books.
Yeah, just
in case anyone would disagree. I like this idea as well. When we're talking about justice. You talk about Columbo in this.
The detective, not the capitalist.
Yeah, Columbo the detective. I liked it. I'll read a little bit because this is a very highbrow book, but it's very relatable at times as well. And I like this bit when you talk about watching like Poirot or Miss Marple or Montalbano or Morse and. Your ritual, weekend afternoon ritual, when you first comes the arrangement of a fortress of cushions and a fluffy blanket, followed by the bringing together of season-appropriate snacks and tea, and then you bed yourself in like a bear, going into hibernation, safe in the knowledge that come the denouement, when the detective has worked everything out and the identity of the criminal is about to be revealed, I will be fast asleep. And the idea that you're sleeping the sleep of the just, the delicious oblivion of someone who can rest safe in the knowledge that somewhere out there justice is being done, the righteous have triumphed, the criminal has been brought to book and all is right in the world, but real life is not like that. And in fact, it's whoever is in charge decides what is right. That's it.
Yeah, this is a recurring theme. So there's 10 chapters, but it's basically the same story over and over again, which is that the power lies in the hands of an extraordinarily privileged few. They arrange the system as best suits them. Please do keep this in mind in light of the upcoming election. And the ways in which we are able to confound them are actually highly limited.
At this point, I'm thinking, do you hate Britain?
Yes.
What about the great traditions of, like, the Magna Carta? I mean, that's... Yeah. We're told... I didn't learn about it at school because I grew up in Ireland and we had our own history there and came to British history, although obviously British history came to us, so we did learn about that. But...
actually, yes, as a former colonised subject, solidarity with the Irish in all these things.
Well, yeah, there you go, I know. So, but we eventually did get to hear about Magna Carta, and it's, I mean, David Cameron would talk about it. We go abroad, people would say, Britain founded democracy, effectively, apparently. But I realised, reading this book, that there were many Magna Cartas, and and Carta is just a charter. And there was a twin one, so the Magna Carta didn't actually apply to people like me. No,
unless you were a baron and we don't know it.
Had I been around then, but there was another version called the Forest Charter. Can you explain a little bit, what was really going on with the Magna Carta?
The thing about Magna Carta, as I say, David Cameron will now hopefully be able to tell us, because he went on TV on the David Letterman show, and David Letterman launched a quiz, which I feel is unsafe. I mean, I love a quiz as much as the next person, but if you're going on as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and then are asked to translate Latin. Although David Cameron did have a classical education, so at the very least he should have been able to say that Magna Carta in translation means Great Charter. And because everything I was taught about Magna Carta at school, the foundations of our democracies, liberal freedoms, equality for everyone under the law, you figure it's great in and of itself, because all these ideas are great ideas. In point of fact, it is a greater charter compared to a lesser one, a little charter, a less well-known one, which was called the Charter of the Forest. And when you find out about what the Charter of the Forest wrote into English and later British law, this is one of those things where I'm going to get the date wrong. The Charter of the Forest was legal writ until 1973? 1971. All the dates in the book are accurate. I did double check them. I just don't keep them in hand or in my head. The Charter of the Forest allows every person in this room to go and plug your phone into the national grid anywhere you want to in the world without paying for it. Sorry, in the country without paying for it. It gives you access to forest land so that you can, your cattle can graze on it, your pigs can go and eat acorns at the appropriate time of the year. You can go and hunt, so you can hunt deer and other smaller game. It meant that every single person in the country had rights to access the land and access to the forest. So not simply fuel and energy, but also for agriculture and also for medicine as well. These are also sources of, we need to remember that science is done by everyone. And that would have been the case up until 1971, where the Charter of the Forest is disbanded.
That sounds revolutionary and astonishing, yes.
Yeah, it's a socialist paradise, practically. It should have been.
And yet,
this
is news to most of us here, I think. Hands up anyone who's familiar with the Forest Charter.
And some of you, I'm going to guess,
I think there's one person, maybe, one or two. Yeah, so here we are missing out on plugging our phones in everywhere and getting all this free stuff.
I use the mobile phone as a metaphor because, obviously, pigs are short on the ground, and also depending on your religion, you probably are not that keen.
So the Magna Carta we have heard of. So what's the difference?
The Magna Carta we have heard of because of the work of an English legal scholar called Edward. Sorry, I'm going to get people's. I misremember the names of white people in history as an act of colonial resistance. Thank you. That gets a lot more love in this room than it would otherwise. Edward Cook. At least I'm pronouncing it. It's written Coke as well, so it's one of those English names that was clearly written, and then they're so drunk they can't pronounce their own name properly. Edward Cook took the Magna Carta, and this is much later, so we're talking about in the 1700s, and he uses it as the basis for kind of beating various monarchs around the head when they are trying to, as he sees it, overstep the mark. So the Magna Carta is seen then as this first step. King John at Runnymede in 1215 puts his seal on the Magna Carta, and it's seen as the first step towards this idea of British democracy that is held up as the beacon for the world, not only for that, but also for the rest of the world as well. The US Constitution supposedly is based on these ideas of universal freedom, as is the United Nations Charter as well. So it's supposedly this basis, but what we forget is that the original Magna Carta only ever applied to a very small number of very, very, very rich and very powerful men. And so the ways, and also, by the way, remember, we don't live in a democracy. Again, drawing your mind to the upcoming election. In this country, it's a constitutional monarchy. And so the Magna Carta is seen as the basis for that constitution. But it never applied to everyone in the way that it's been represented. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
The Charter of the Forest did, but the Charter of the Forest is no longer law.
It was law, but it didn't feel as though it applied.
No, and that's to do with a load of creeping legislation that comes in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. If you ever feel like you're being censored, there's nothing like when someone walks in front of you in the middle of a.
Yeah.
This is what they don't want you to know.
Yes.
So 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, you will all be aware, is the same time as not only the height of British imperialism, but the rise of British imperialism, but also people in this country making money off the profits of the free labor of enslaved African people, be it in the Caribbean or be it in North America. And when they are making their money, so what we need to remember, by the way, I think a lot of people mistake this. They think it was rich people that had slaves. It works the other way around. It's having slaves that makes you rich. And when people were rich in this country, what they did was they were able to buy positions, legal positions and also, political positions. They wanted to be justice of the peace, because if you weren't already a lord, this was a way of buying political influence. And they therefore become judges in their own land, and therefore they're able to find ways in which to legislate for their own land, and that is when enclosure comes in. So even though the Charter of the Forest applies, people start enclosing the land, kicking off the common farmers who've been there for generations, and they start to build, well, first of all, they start to build hedgerows, but they also build walls. Mm-hmm. So this is the other thing to keep in mind about the Charter of the Forest. Richard Drax, current Conservative MP in Cornwall, owner of the largest or the longest private wall in the country, that is how far back his family money dates, is to this period. We're talking hundreds of years.
I feel that this hall should be bigger and we should be inviting in the whole of Britain to hear this, not our subcontinental diaspora. Now, and maybe we should make it even bigger again to invite in the whole of America, because you said this is supposedly also in what the Americans base their constitution, and they talk about a shining city on the hill, Washington, D.C., and allusions to ancient Greece and Rome. But I was interested to see in your book that they actually took inspiration from much, much closer to home in a way that few people would be aware of, I think.
Yeah, so this is the Haudenosaunee, which, so if people aren't familiar...
So who were the Haudenosaunee?
The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois League, which is a confederation of originally 5 and then later 6 different indigenous American tribes. I had to choose my words really carefully there, because you can't say Native American, because not all of them are within the bounds of the United States. They had come together under the banner of what they called the Great Law of Peace. And what they had essentially constituted was a confederacy. You had individual nations. They retained their individuality, their individual power, but they elected leaders who came to sit around the table. These are people who were elected. The roles could be passed on from a father to a son, but if the son turned out not to be very good at the job, they could get kicked out. Women were the people who did the electing. So there is a huge amount of feminist history in terms of what we think about where the power comes from here. And the Haudenosaunee, also called the Iroquois League, the way that they worked was on a series of unanimity. So as a league, everyone had to agree on what they were going to do as a body corporate. But then they would, at other parts of the year, separate off and go and do their own thing. So in what is going to become the United States in the early 1700s, what you have is basically a bunch of, they're drug runners. They're high on tea. We
they're
in
not
part
all bad,
need to be responsible for that. Yeah. And what they are hugely resentful of is the fact that the British government is taxing their illegal profits. And so what they say is no taxation without representation, and that is the basis of their fight for independence. What they were saying was, do not take the money that we are creaming off the colonists, and don't expect us to do that without putting up a fight. But they cover it in the mantle of this idea of what they call democracy. And what they did was they took the Roman model, so the Senate, the capital. We can see the Roman model hugely at play in the way that Washington, D.C. and the U.S. democracy is set up. We can also see demagogues at play here as well, the one who's just been convicted and is still going to be running for president and may still become elected. So, the Founding Fathers had nothing on Donald Trump. But what they do is they take this idea of constitution, but they never give it credit. They never give it credit for the fact, because I think it's Benjamin Franklin who says, it seems really unusual that if a bunch of savages have this very sophisticated way of governing themselves, that a bunch of English people should be able to do the same thing. So and who knows, it may still happen. So Thomas Paine gets a lot of credit for setting up the US democracy. The ancient Greeks and Romans and all those classical references and these ideals of democracy, and again, equality under the law come into play. We don't get to hear about the Haudenosaunee. Because, of course, the way that this system works is it takes away the rights of women. And it also, the reason why the Roman model is so popular is because it means that you can build a society fueled and powered by the work of the enslaved.
And this kind of goes to your title about 10 lies that made the West. I suppose when people are thinking of foundational myths, the Haudenosaunee get left out.
Entirely,
We don't want to attribute that. I like there was a little note saying that I remember I used to go to the Isle of Man as a child, and they would talk about having the oldest parliament in the world, the Tynwald. Turns out it's only the third oldest, and the Haudenosaunee were the second. In Europe, saying at 1150, and the Icelanders, they had one even earlier than that, so they're the first. And what happened to these constitutional Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, Native Americans who had this system upon which the United States was based? How did they fare when their system was incorporated?
Not great.
Shock.
This is one of the longest and ongoing genocides, as we're seeing. It's important, by the way, every time I say that word in public, I have to make a point. Genocides are not confined to history. We're seeing one of them being carried out right now. So solidarity with the students protesting outside, and also bearing in mind, thank you. That's a real relief, because I've actually been in rooms where I've said that and people have got up and walked out. So which is, they're right, people are entitled to their opinion, however wrong they might be. And when we talk about Palestine, we should also at the same time not forget to talk about Congo and Sudan, where there's similar horrendousness is being carried out. But yeah, Native Americans are by and large confined to very small quarters of the United States, at best treated as if they are second-class citizens. And yeah, this is another story that occurs in an earlier chapter where I talk about the Cherokee, one of the supposedly 5 civilized tribes of the U.S., and the story of the Trail of Tears, which is when 16,000 people are chased off their land, off their farms, off their homestead, and marched for months into the Indian country reservations in the middle of the United States, and a quarter of them die along the way.
And it's interesting to note that they're chased off their farms.
Yeah.
So I suppose people, I don't know, maybe from films have an idea of nomadic people wandering around on horses and not...
Which did exist,
Sure.
There's a multiplicity of American indigenous ways, or North American indigenous ways of living off the land.
There was another one, staying in America. I think something that you will be familiar with, a lot more familiar with. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that rings a bell with people, I guess. Okay, there's nodding. Now, that came from America, but not necessarily from where you would think. Tell us about that and how what it was before it became a psychological or a management technique.
Yeah, and the management is where the knife really goes in. But yeah, I learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs when I was studying psychology in high school. I went to an American high school in the Middle East, and we learned about this pyramid that Maslow came up with. Your base needs are your physical needs, so clean air to breathe, food, water, shelter. Then safety needs, so I guess shelter comes in there as well, but also ideas of social safety. The higher up you go, you have certain social needs that need to be met. And then at the apex of the pyramid is this idea of self-actualization. Maslow said that very few, only a handful of people, even that he could think of, had ever reached this pinnacle of self-actualization. They were motivated to do what they did purely from internal ideas. So Maslow very famously said a few people had managed this. Mahatma Gandhi was one of the people that he thought was self-actualized. Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, and also Abraham Maslow was one of the people who had attained this very, But what a lot of people don't know is that Maslow's ideas to do with how he started thinking about this were a real 180-degree turn from how he starts out. He starts out as a behavioral psychologist. Behavioral psychology basically involves cruelty to animals for most of the first half of the 20th century. It's pigeons in boxes being taught to play ping pong, etc. And Maslow had this idea that sexual dominance was the way in which civilized people acted. If you'll forgive the expression, I'm going to bring the energy down, but it basically big dick energy is the way in which to be the most advanced and the most powerful, according to him. He was lecturing in Brooklyn. He'd come back to his native New York at this point, and he fell in with a bunch of anthropologists. It can happen to anyone. One of them was a woman called Ruth Benedict, who was part of a vanguard of anthropologists who were very much undermining the original foundations of the discipline that they had taken on. Anthropology starts out in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries. A lot of it is literally white Europeans going out to various parts of the world and measuring non-white women's breasts. That is kind of how the science worked. What this new vanguard, including Ruth Benedict, is trying to do is to say these universal values, these universal ideas to do with civilization based on racial hierarchy are things we need to confound and be suspicious of. So huge credit to Ruth Benedict. And she set Maslow a challenge. She said, you know what, if your theory of sexual dominance does apply to everyone, go out to the Blackfoot Nation, where I'm sending some of my students to work this summer, and find out if it works with them.
And where were they geographically?
They are, so the Blackfoot Nation is at a place called Siksika, which is over the border. So it's about an hour's drive away from Ottawa in Canada. So the northern border of the United States, southern border of Canada. These, again, are farming people. If you want to hear the huge catalogue of horrendousnesses done unto the Blackfoot Nation, that's going to be a whole other lecture. I'm mindful, because this is one of my favourite stories, so I will talk about it at length if given the opportunity.
So he got there, and what did he find?
Please. And what he found was, first of all, people who refused to fill in questionnaires, which can only be something that we can respect. But what he also found was that the people of the Blackfoot Nation refused to talk about other people in the Blackfoot Nation in ways that were derogatory. What he found was a community of Indigenous American people surrounded by some of the most hideous white racists that you can possibly imagine, who were stealing their land and undermining the ways in which they were making their living. And the other thing that they found the other thing that Maslow found was people who gave no truck to possessions. They didn't see the point in having things unless they were things to give away. And also a society based very much on the principle of no person left behind. And so if you were hungry, it meant that you should have food. If you were unhoused, it meant that you should be given shelter. It's not a question of whether you deserve these things. It's not a question of whether you are civilized and you demonstrate the fact that you have made a performance that means you're allowed to have these things. People are born credentialed. The fact that you exist as a human is all that's required. And this is where his ideas of meeting those basic physical needs and then this idea that you as an individual meet a certain level of being able to express your individuality. This over the course of time, so he writes this up in various articles, he writes books about this idea of self-actualization. The other thing that he missed was, as far as the Blackfoot Nation are concerned, an individual should aspire to be self-actualized, but only with the idea of transcendence in mind. There is every value in me being able to express myself to the best of my ability, desire, and work, but only in the service of my community. There's no point in me being an individual if I don't work for other people. So
there's this phrase, which is your phrase, because I read it in your book,
yeah.
So Blackfoot worldview is that the real power of the individual is to contribute to the collective power of the community, which seems a world away from what I had previously assumed lay behind Maslow's hierarchy of needs. a completely individual thing actually derived from a collective community.
Yeah, and this is still how these folks live now. And they find it... so I learned a lot about this from a scholar called Ryan Heavyhead, who's one of the founders of Kainai Studies. And he did a huge amount of research. There's a lot of things circulating on Instagram and TikTok about Maslow and the Blackfoot Nation, and to do with the symbolism of the Blackfoot teepee. These things, that's not the case. But it's definitely the case that we wouldn't understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs and his ideas about self-actualization if it wasn't for the Blackfoot Nation.
So it seems there's a bit of a pattern emerging here. We find an interesting way of governing, or an interesting way of living, or an interesting way of recording history, and we nick it and pretend it was ours in the first place, and cover over the roots or eradicate them. And is that such a recurrent theme in the West and what has made the West? Is it? It can't all be theft.
Really? Remember? Well, I mean, they didn't.
Or can it?
Yes, well, true. I mean, remember, and I say this in the chapter about art. They didn't even have a word for loot. They stole that one from us, which is not something necessarily to be hugely proud of, by the way. But just to make the point. I think, so clearly, as someone who has very obviously been colonized by their own accent, the goal here is not to do down the West much, or any more than it actually deserves. The goal is to highlight that all of these things that have been sold to us probably aren't quite the thing that we think that they are, and also to point out that the people who have stood up for these goals and these ideals are the ones who have been diminished and dismissed as being uncivilized. If we look at people like Mahatma Gandhi, if we look at people like Dr. Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, these are all, actually maybe not Malcolm X so much, because Malcolm was always quite so virulent and violent in the ways in which he said that resistance should be done. But Dr. King and Gandhi particularly, they're almost, they've been turned into these figures without a huge amount of punch to them, because what supposedly they did was they were just non-violent and they just took it. And it was through their natural dignity that suddenly the West realized that perhaps they were being bad. That's not the case. And by no means should we sit back and take what is given to us as far as these things are concerned, because as I hope I'm able to demonstrate, there is a huge amount of hypocrisy that goes into this idea of Western civilization.
Okay. I have other things to ask. However, I don't want you to be sitting here just taking what you're being given through me.
Oh, very good.
So I want to invite some questions now. If you have them, great. If you don't, I can carry on. But we have one up there near that pillar. If, I don't know, if there's a mic. If there isn't a mic, maybe just, there is one coming here. So, yes.
Yeah, in terms of all the things that you've been elaborating and unpacking and exploring, and because it is so pertinent and so contemporary, I would really welcome your perceptions of the state of Palestine.
I'm by no means an expert, apart from the fact that I was born and brought up in the Middle East, and so therefore a lot of what I'm having to do right now is to confront a lot of inbuilt anti-Semitism. So while I do express my solidarity with the Palestinian people, please let us bear in mind that anti-Semitism in this country is at record levels. This is the magic of racism, is that we can be absolutely horrendous to two supposedly opposing groups of people at the same time. But what is the case with Palestine is that the discourse at the moment suggests that everything that is happening now was started on October 7. And that certainly isn't the case. It goes a long way back, and with ideas to do with the Palestine Mandate, the Balfour Declaration, the original Nakba of 1948, I can give you. You can look them up. A whole list of dates. It needs to stop. It needs to stop. I'm mindful of the fact that really a two-state solution kind of is the only way forward at this point in time. We've seen that a one-state solution isn't going to work. But, okay, let me actually focus on my expertise. So much of the ways in which Palestinian people are spoken about in the media or in general, the ways that they are presented, is as savage, as uncivilized, as not worthy of, as barbaric. You know, they are presented as being problematic in and of themselves innately. And when that is not the case, they are seen that their role is to die. And what's happening now, and the reason why, and when I see people say what is happening there is not genocide, is that they're not seen to be dying in sufficient numbers. This is the world we're living in now. We should be ashamed. And so many of us just sat and let it happen, and we're still continuing to as well. You know, and in the state of our democracy and the way our two-party system works at the moment, you feel like you're throwing away your vote. I want to know how I can vote for Jeremy Corbyn despite the fact that I don't live in Islington North. Okay, and he's not unproblematic in and of himself, but you know.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, there's one up there. Is that Swazi? Yeah.
All right, Uncle.
Thank you. Having worked in the museum sector myself, historic royal palaces.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I know,
I
know,
okay?
right?
Yeah.
I'm still in therapy. I heard the phrase decolonising history so frequently, and yet we still have pieces of work that are so outside of the norm. You may not be able to answer this, but where does that begin? How do we begin decolonising history? Because what our children are learning and what we are experiencing is still very colonial history.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, rule number one is stop lying about it. And also stop being so disingenuous about it. I mean, apparently King Charles has said that he is, you know, ashamed about what happened with the transatlantic trade in enslaved African people. He's going to launch an inquiry as to whether the royal family had something to do with it. And I was like, let me point you to the letter R in Royal African Company. And to, you know, let's just follow where the money has been coming from. Honestly, when you learn about Magna Carta and you see that these guys have just been related to each other for the last 800 years. So first of all, stop lying about it. Second of all, actually, and, you know, here we are in this room. And I write about this in the second chapter, which is about education and all about the Black Saturday School movement, is that we teach our own histories too. And what our children should be learning is histories that make them proud to be who they are and understand what their contributions have been to the world. So the idea that it is the world and the civilized world, all of the art, all of the things that are worth celebrating are purely the purview of white people is something, again, that we need to dismantle. By the way, a little survival tip for you. Everything that you are doing, I'm sure, is decolonial and decolonizing. Don't use the word. It scares the horses.
Is there, do you think, possible to come up with a curriculum or a history that includes everyone, that is not lying and disingenuous as much as now, and can make people feel about the contributions of all the various heritages that make up Britain, and includes, I don't know, people who feel they've always been here. I'm not sure who that would be exactly. But I suppose isn't seen as, or painted by the right-wing media as a stick to make British people feel bad about themselves. Yeah. One, I suppose, a joyful, positive one, including lots of the stories you have, which, I mean, Americans should be embracing their true history, I think. Some of the, obviously, the appalling aspects of it, but also wonderful aspects of it. And I guess that would apply to here too.
Yeah.
In a more honest way. Is that a possible thing, or is it still at the stage of being oppositional, factional?
Unfortunately, because of the culture war parameters in which we are existing, whereby, I will refer you to the subtitle of my own book. Until we start to break down this barrier between civilized and uncivilized, that is still an impossibility. Because what this barrier does is suggest that non-white people are somehow, not only are they somehow lesser, but their knowledge and their stories either don't exist or are not worth knowing. And so, yeah, by all means, we can definitely build this future, but it has to be done together.
And do you think it will happen as Britain becomes more and more generations of multicultural existence?
I mean,
Or will people sort of, I don't know, buy into it?
I try to resist this idea that, so to quote Martin Luther King, that the arc of justice, moves. Sorry, what is it? The arc of. I'm going to end up misquoting Martin Luther King, which is a bad idea.
It ends in a pot of gold.
It ends in a pot of gold. Yeah. This idea that things somehow magically become better. Naming no people who write about the supposed better angels of our nature. This idea that somehow we get better magically by ourselves is possibly a little bit unhelpful. We do get better, but when I came in, we were having this conversation about we all need to be talking to each other. Let me quote Maya Angelou, it's only equals who can make friends.
Okay, all right. Let's go. That man looks familiar. I think it's Rahul. Question. The mic's coming to you, Rahul.
Yeah.
I'd just like to ask you, giving you just 2 or 3 examples of what Indian civilization was, and did you think this was being civilized? One, the practice of untouchability in India. Number 2, widows having to immolate themselves once their husband died. Now, the British, in their own way, tried to get rid of all this.
Very much in their own way, yeah.
Yeah, well, they did it. They got rid of sati, for instance. Wasn't that an uncivilized thing which was got rid of by people who, in many ways, and even widow remarriage? I'm just giving you 3 or 4 examples where the British did do, at least in my view, did some good by getting rid of uncivilized practices. Wouldn't you admit that widow sati of widows having to immolate themselves was uncivilized? Untouchability is uncivilized.
It is easy enough to say those things. What I would do, and actually there is a very deliberate decision, speaking as someone of Indian heritage, as to why I didn't include Indian stories to quite the level I probably would have wanted to in this book, is when we look at the ways the history of racialization worked, is that Hindus of caste and light-skinned Hindus were considered white. And that is something that we all need to sit with. Certainly ideas of untouchability and the ways in which Dalit communities were and also continue to be treated in South Asia is something that we need to be mindful of. What I'm trying to say is that these divisions and these ways of speaking, it's not an account book. It's not a question of we did bad things and therefore, and they did some good things. It's about the fact that we are all in this together. But even internally, we try to think that some people are still right in the way that they do things, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. And this is the thing that needs breaking down, because what it continues to do is to sow division between people. And the moment that we hold on to these ideals to do with who was right and who was wrong, that's not helping. Of course, women should be treated with equality in society. Of course, caste is a hideous way of running a society. I don't think those problems have been solved. And I think the ways in which we start to solve them require greater deals of solidarity, certainly than the British demonstrated when they were in South Asia, and certainly more than is being demonstrated in the countries that are in the aftermath of empire and the Raj.
Do you think there should be an equivalent book to yours, 10 Lies That Made China, 10 Lies That Made India?
I mean, it's all the same lie. It's all capitalism. So it's a relatively short book.
Any follow-up questions from the chuckling row there? No. Okay. There's a hand up over there. Lovely.
Yes. Well, there would be lots to talk about, but focusing on the theme of Heal the World, how, first of all, what's your conception of what that means as an aspiration, and then how would you apply the insights from a very varied professional life into how we would go about it?
So many people in our society exist at so many different stages as to how ideas of race proliferate. I think, unfortunately, we're still stuck in a very basic stage of it would be nice for non-white people to be able to walk around the streets of this country without worrying about having slurs thrown at them. But what it's important to point out is the way that racism works isn't simply people saying nasty things to other people. In point of fact, class is a really important thing to think about here as well. The way that racism works is that it's systemic. It reproduces systems of inequality. This is what we mean by institutional racism. So when it comes to organizations like a university or a museum, institutional racism is when the normal functioning of the organization reproduces racist outcomes. It's why, for example, it's really difficult for people of South Asian heritage to work in places like Royal Historic Palaces. And so, to my mind, the way that we go forward together is to dismantle the systems and the organizations that reproduce these outcomes. The trouble is, first of all, there is so much reluctance that people even want to acknowledge that racism is something that's systemic. Usually it's something, we say like, oh, it's these poor, uneducated, lower class people. They're the racists. The racists are the people who sit in Parliament and on the throne. Okay. So, yeah, we need to dismantle the systems that produce these outcomes as if they are something that is natural and something that is good in and of itself. The revolution starts here today.
Okay, well, it's getting good and revolutionary. I see fist being brandished there. Some people might feel that, but I like this stuff.
Oh,
And now you're spoiling it for me. You're
Yeah.
telling me things I don't want to hear. So in that spirit, I write crime fiction and I love it, and I know you like watching it too.
yeah.
And however, the people like Agatha Christie, the golden age of crime, that's quite problematic too. I just don't want to leave anything that we enjoy, untrashed here.
Yeah.
So now. I mentioned at the start that you specialise in scientific racism and eugenics, and
Yes.
saying,
Critical attitudes to those, by the way, I should point out. Yeah.
not liking it.
Yeah.
And so we've got a little bit of time to talk about that. And I wonder, to what extent should I not be enjoying Agatha Christie after all?
Well, certainly to the first and then the second title of the book that we know as And Then There Were None. Certainly up until the point of her fairly hideous anti-Semitism that pretty much leaps off the page, sadly, a lot at the beginning and even more unforgivably toward the end of her career. But these attitudes to do with who is considered to be criminal. So many South Asian folks in the room may or may not know that fingerprinting, so forensic science of fingerprinting, comes from being pioneered in the Raj, because the British couldn't tell the Indian people apart. And so they needed to come up with a systematic and categorical way of being able to distinguish between individuals, because otherwise they didn't know whether or not they were throwing the right people in jail.
Who cares?
I mean, who even cares? That's fine. We all have a cousin who can do that for us. These ideas to do with race are not simply about, people's skin color, their hair color, and their hair color, hair texture, all of those sorts of things. They are bound up in pretty much everything to do with our identities, our gender, our class, our body size, our sexuality, and also whether or not we are considered to be criminal or whether we are considered to be civilized and well-behaved. So, crime fiction is, I'm planning on setting my sights on that one next. In terms
Next book?
Well, we make no promises. We make no promises.
Well, I think that's a great note on which to wrap up this session. I thank you very much to our contributors, and I think it's sort of quite timely that this discussion has taken place in SOAS, which, as you know, has a long and complicated history, and in recent years has been very much looking at ideas of decolonising the curriculum. When I was here myself as a professor for many years, one of the things I deeply regretted was the lack of focus on language scholarship, which had been so much part of its past, because I think without languages, English is a great colonizer itself as a language. But thank you very much for the many stimulating ideas from our speakers. We're going to maybe applaud them, please, before I do maybe. And I've got your party bags. I've got your party bags, which I'd like to give you for a little token of appreciation.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you very much.
I didn't realise you'd been waving. I thought we had another 15 minutes.
No, I was actually meant to do the question.
Ah. Oh.
Oh dear.
But also to say that we're going to take a break for lunch. We've got an hour and a quarter, but we would like to start very promptly this afternoon. We've got an exciting session, a festival of democracy with S.Y. Qureshi speaking. I think that will be a timely and exciting contribution. There is lunch for the patrons and the speakers. For other people, there are many places around here. I don't need to list them. I assume the cafe's still open in Russell.